Welcome to the Independent Learner Podcast. Here we talk honestly about what it means to raise curious, confident learners outside conventional school. Brought to you by Mosaic, we share real conversations, practical ideas, and honest stories from people living learner-led lives every day. Let's dive in. What if the moments that feel the hardest, the resistance, the shutdowns, the pushback, are actually the clearest signals we have? For many families raising neurodivergent children, especially those with PDA, daily life can feel like a constant negotiation with a nervous system that is working overtime to stay safe. Behaviors that are often labeled as defiant or avoidant can leave parents feeling confused, concerned, and unsure how to help. In this conversation, we're joined by Rabbi Shoshana Meira Friedman, creator of the PDA Safe Circle. Together, we'll explore a different way of understanding what's happening beneath the surface and how shifting our lens can change everything about how we respond. This is not about managing behavior. It's about understanding the nervous system, creating safety, and building the conditions where your young person can actually thrive. Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. What a wonderful introduction. Couldn't agree with everything you said anymore.
Awesome. Well, let's start with some grounding. For parents who are new to this, how do you define PDA? And what does that actually mean in daily life?
Great question. So PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance, which is a terrible, terrible name, but you should know that that is what clinical studies will call it. The community has renamed it pervasive drive for autonomy, and we just sort of generally just use the initials PDA. It's important just for everyone to know that there is no one established definition of PDA at this point. It's understood by many, but there is not a clinical consensus here that it's a sort of subset of autism. It is sometimes designated by a clinician underneath an ADHD or autism diagnosis. It's not in any DSM at this point. There's a movement to hopefully remedy that. The way that I and others in what I would like to call the grassroots mental health movement, that is part of the neurodiversity movement, right? Part of the disability justice movement. This movement I'm a part of that I would call as a grassroots mental health and neurodiversity subset, that is the PDA community. Many of us understand PDA as follows. PDA is a nervous system disability in which a person's autonomic nervous system, so underneath any conscious thought, right? This is the same system that governs breathing and digestion. The autonomic nervous system is wired to be extremely sensitive to losses of the following four things, even very subtle losses. So those four are losses of autonomy, losses of control, losses of social status or social equality, and I add this one in, losses of co-regulation. So losses of control, autonomy, social status or equality, and losses of co-regulation in daily life land on the PDA nervous system as threats, again, in that subconscious, physiological, not psychological, a physiological sense of I'm in danger underneath conscious thought. Every human has these triggers, right? None of us are going to like losses of autonomy, control, social status, or co-regulation, but the average bear has a much higher tolerance. And so PDAers are sensing these threats when a direct question is asked, the need to go to the bathroom, another person directing our learning or our work, the subtle play of social status that might be happening in conversation, somebody changing the subject. When we weren't ready, I always give the example with my kid where before we understood PDA, if there was a misplaced mark on a piece of paper with a marker that we couldn't erase, it might become a 45-minute meltdown. So that was a loss of his control, right, over reality. He couldn't control that. So it's a pattern of inner experience, and that then ends up being a pattern of behavior, especially when not accommodated well, that can lead to a whole host of really intense struggles. That said, PDA, in my opinion, I approach it as a full neurotype, meaning it's not a set of symptoms. It's an underlying nervous system wiring that has those 4 intense triggers, but that tends to go along with a whole cluster of also incredible strengths. So, which include, and I talk about this more, but we tend to see some really interesting clusters of strengths in the realms of leadership, in the realms of empathy, in the realms of creativity, and in the realms of learning, which I know we'll get into more. So, pervasive drive for autonomy doesn't have a clinical consensus, but in the grassroots, we're really looking at this being defined as a nervous system disability with particular triggers that are innate to the person's body, and that can go along with strengths, but also be quite disabling when not understood or accommodated.
Fascinating. One of the words you used as you were defining the triggers was co-regulation. What do you mean by that? Because some of folks listening might not know.
Great question. So a great example is when I was a small child, 1, 2, 3 years old, my parents would want to go out for the evening, and I would have an utter panic attack. It felt like my body was disintegrating. Like I know what it felt like because I still felt it as I got older, sometimes from my parents, and then later from my boyfriend, and then my husband. So it would feel like my body was like I was just losing a sense of myself. Like my cells were just pulling apart, full on panic. Like my body was leaking out of my legs. I'm not sure how else to describe it. It felt like my body was being wrenched apart. I did not have any childhood adverse experiences. Okay. I came from a stable home. I had loving parents. There was zero abuse. There was no abandonment trauma by any outsider. But my body felt my parents leaving as an existential threat. So my parents leaving is a loss of the co-regulating human who my little self was so dependent on. Plenty of kids might feel nervous about a babysitter coming over. This was an entirely different level. This isn't nervous. It's autonomic terror, panic. So what we see in a lot of PDA kids is extreme separation anxiety, often from parents, sometimes from siblings. In adults, because PDA is lifelong, I'm an adult PDA, or I support PDAers of all ages. In adults, it can look like really intense attachment to romantic partners. It can lead to being, I believe that we are very susceptible to codependency because we can feel really terrified of leaving a relationship, even if it isn't working, because that loss of co-regulation. And look, nobody likes a breakup, but if you're wired with very low nervous system capacity to feel safe to begin with, because you're so hypervigilant to threat, we tend to lean on other humans in a way that a more like an infant might lean on a parent than like an adult might lean on a parent. A typical adult might lean on a parent. So it could look like a parent leaving the house to go grocery shopping. It could look like a kid being dropped off at school. It could look like when my child was in burnout, I literally couldn't leave the room he was in without triggering a panic attack. So that's pretty intense. Healthy PDAers who have a wide enough safe circle, we can talk about my metaphor, are not going to be so disabled by this, but the trigger is there, and enough losses of co-regulation can be very stressful.
For parents working with their young people who might be PDAers, how can they distinguish between, or is this even the right way to think about it, willful behavior and a nervous system response?
I just never like the term willful behavior. I feel like it sort of starts on the wrong train. And as my wonderful, I love this quote, my wonderful geology professor at Oberlin College said, when you're on the wrong train, every stop's the wrong stop. And it's like, if you start with the wrong assumptions, you're just going to lead to a lot of wrong assumptions. So here's the way I think about it. We got to go back to like, what is a child? What is a human? Okay. Humans are social great apes. From an evolutionary perspective, we are evolved to live in small tribes of interdependent, collaborating individuals. Our young, right, our babies are hardwired to want to please their adults and to learn from us. Otherwise, you can't dispute that that's how it works, right? There's no way humans get from where we were 100,000 years ago a million years ago as a species to where we are now without us being hardwired for this pro-social learning and wanting to cooperate and be together in groups. So what that means to me is that a child who is quote unquote misbehaving is not doing so because of some inherent deficit in their character. I mean, with few exceptions, there probably are. It's beyond my pay grade to talk about like true sociopath or psychopath situations, right? We're talking about folks who are without that kind of pathology. That's beyond my pay grade to talk about. We are pro-social, so willful behavior of misbehavior. Like, let's step back and think, well, okay, my kid wants to be a functioning member of this household. So what might be going on that's triggering a behavior that doesn't feel like it's jiving, right? So we start with there. Whether it's nervous system disability or other kinds of struggle, a big tool that I offer is this idea of the safe circle. So the safe circle is a visual metaphor. You can find it in the Safe Circle coloring book, which is a free resource that we'll put in the show notes. So if you picture that everyone you know, your child has an imaginary circle that you live inside. It's your safe circle. Everything that feels safe or okay and regulating to your body is in that circle. Everything that triggers a threat response of some kind is outside that circle. And the circle fluctuates in capacity day to day. So there are some things on the boundary of the circle where sometimes you can access them and it's fine, and sometimes you can't. And this is true for everybody. This is the safe circle metaphor. I use it to support PDAers, but it is actually like the great secret is it's for everyone with a nervous system. So every single person. And also it works for animals as well. So when we're talking about how do we tell if this is, a struggle that is based in, I don't know, like the math just feels too hard, and so I don't want to do it, versus I really can't, and you're hitting up against an existential fear, and not fear is the wrong word. I actually want to be careful about that. An existential trigger, like I'm in danger. One thing is to really verse yourself in nervous system threat responses. So when we think about that safe circle, inside the circle, when you are in a zone of, I haven't studied, I don't know much about the zone of tolerance, but I've heard that what I do maps there decently. So when you're inside your safe circle, your body feels safe and well and okay. When you're outside, fully outside, you are either in a fight response. So you've lost access to your thinking brain, your amygdala, to oversimplify things, has taken over. And in a fight response, you're lashing out at somebody else. In a flight response, you're running away or getting silly or climbing on the furniture. In a freeze response, you're hyper alert, but you can't move. In a flop response, you can't move, but you're getting sleepy, like your body's shutting down. And in a fawn response, you're people pleasing, but inside your body is really, really stressed. Like you're people pleasing out of threat, not out of regulation and joy. And then the last one that's common with PDAers is flood. And that's where you get overwhelmed by big emotions. All of these are ways that our body tries to stay safe in the face of a really intense threat. Part of what makes PDA so disabling is that those are great responses when you're faced with a bear. They're great responses if you're in the middle of a street and a car is coming at you. They're great responses if somebody is trying to harm you, right? They're great responses if you need to stand up to protect your child in a dangerous situation. They are not really all that useful when you're being asked a direct question, when you're being asked to do a chore, right? It's exhausting, but there they are. So in between the circle where you feel safe and all those threat responses on the outside is what I call the buffer zone. And this is where you can notice that your child or you using what I would call less intense, still subconscious. You're not like, oh, let me procrastinate in order to stay safe. You just are procrastinating, or like, let me get critical in order to stay safe. No, you just start criticizing. But these are like mild versions of threat responses that are not, you haven't fully lost your mind yet, but you're buffering against it. And if the threat goes away, then you can get back in your safe circle. But if the threat keeps coming, then you go into a full-on, one of the Fs, one of the fight, flight, freeze, et cetera. So how do you know whether it's PDA, nervous system distress, or some other struggle? Are the patterns of threat response coming with losses of autonomy, control, social equality, or co-regulation? And if you track your kiddo's safe circle over time and you're not making changes to how you interact with them and what the expectations are in their environment, is their safe circle shrinking? Because what we'll see, like for my kiddo, he was in school and his safe circle is getting smaller and smaller. This was before I had coined the term. A child who is in a school, like I know your listeners are mostly not in school environments, but I'm guessing that many of them were, at least at some point. So a kiddo who's dropped off in September at school and is a little nervous, maybe cries a little bit, then has a great day, comes home, maybe a little tired, but no big deal. Then, has a snack, a rest, goes off and plays. Great. No problem. You'd accept that maybe there's a week of a little bit of teariness at the door of the classroom, but over time, things get easier. The thing with a nervous system, a PDA nervous system, and any really vulnerable nervous system is that if you keep poking at it, things do not get easier, they get harder. They get harder because what we're looking at is not a psychological issue. It's not, I don't believe that I'm capable of this math homework, so I'm scared of it. It's my body is going into an autonomic fight or flight, et cetera, response when faced with this math problem. And the more you poke me with the math problem, the more physiologically stressed my body becomes. And physiological stress gets worse with exposure. It does not get better. Right? Extreme psychological stress would be the same, but with just the right amount of just right challenge, we can get over the psychological humps. But if you are in threat response and you are going to get worse and worse, your safe circle is going to shrink, which is what happened to my kid. The drop-offs got harder and harder and harder, not easier. So you want to be looking, I'm sorry, it wasn't a very succinct answer, but essentially you want to be looking at, is your child's safe circle shrinking or growing? Are they going into a true threat response, which could look hidden? It might be a shutdown. It doesn't have to be lashing out. And keep in mind that your child is a social great ape. They want to be well. They want to take care of themselves. They want to mimic the social norms of their society. They want to please their elders. This is how human babies survive. It's hardwired. So when a child is struggling, we want to always assume there is a very real, legitimate reason. And then whether it's a PDA reason or some other reason, let's get to the bottom of it and support the kid.
It's a beautiful segue to my next question, which is, and as you mentioned, in Mosaic, we support families on a alternative path to education and learning for their young people, self-directed education, unschooling. We call it independent learning. Why does that approach work well with PDAers?
Yeah, great question. So if we go back to this idea of strengths, let's focus there. I think I have a 6-element approach to supporting PDAers. I call it the PDA Safe Circle approach. And it's a strengths-based approach. It starts with this whole idea of what is a human, right? And that we are hardwired to use our strengths for the good of our group, for the good of our body, to learn, to explore. This is just who we are. And we know from brain science, from all kinds of children, not just PDAers, that the more you give extrinsic rewards, sticker charts, grades, et cetera, for pro-social behaviors like cooperation, like critical thinking, like complex skill building, the less motivated the child or adult is to do them. Okay, the more you extrinsically reward it, the less motivated, which makes perfect sense, because why would you want a reward for something that is in your true nature to do? It's insulting and it's confusing. And it actually gives our kids the message that it's not in their true nature to be learners, to be creative, to have their passions, to follow their curiosity, to be cooperative, to be empathic. Why are we extrinsically rewarding this other than to say, hey, thank you, I really appreciate that, right? That kind of like relational feedback, great. But this like, oh, you get a star, you get a ticket, right? So PDAers are particularly sensitive to that kind of BS from PDA kids, right? Are particularly sensitive to that kind of BS from adults. And it will, my child at age 7 or 6 named this, he called it a duplication glitch, which is a term from gaming. He said, I already wanted to not run in my classroom. But when the teacher started handing out blue tickets to say, good job, you're not running, it was a duplication glitch in my brain. And I started running because it was like my PDA part. This is my kid, right? He said, my PDA part was like, oh, well, if it's about you needing me to not run, then I guess I'm going to run because I need to have control over my own body. So we come at I come at this from the strengths-based perspective. PDAers want to be able to express our strengths. And some of our really big strengths are most of the people who find me are autistic and PDA. Maybe all PDAers are autistic, but there's a whole big debate about that. And my doors are open to anyone for whom this framework makes sense. So we tend to really excel as autodidacts. That's a fun, fancy word for teach yourself. We love to not have somebody else in the expert role. We want to be in the expert role, which makes sense if you've got a very high trigger to losses of autonomy, social equality, control, et cetera. So I don't want someone else to be the expert and teach me. I want to have access to the information and be in relationship to that skill, to that creative project, to the passion myself, and not be under, so to speak, in like a lower status social role. So those are two reasons that unschooling works so well. One is you don't have all the BS of like the extrinsic rewards that just mess with everybody, and particularly PDAers. The other is that it offers so much time for us to use our autistic deep dive learning passions and to do it on our own terms, which is how we tend to excel. And I think a third reason is that the regimented schedules of like getting up in the morning, like just the logistical piece, the getting up, the changing your clothes, the eating breakfast in a hurry, the getting out the door. There are like 10 transitions in between waking up and getting a child to a school. Everything from literally physically getting out of bed to walking to the bathroom, to sitting wherever you're going to eat breakfast, to putting on your shoes and leaving the house. And then you're in the car, and then you leave the house and you have to get in the car, which used to take me and my kid like 10 minutes. Every single transition is hard. That can be true for autistics in general, but it's especially true for a lot of PDAers where it's the loss of autonomy in every single transition. Those antennas are going on high alert. So what unschooling does is it liberates us from simply the external, like all of the noise around the learning, which is really what's so hard. It also removes all of that messy social pressure of a classroom. Again, what is a human child? We sure as heck did not evolve to be in a class of 20, 25, 30 people the exact same age as us. That's bonkers, right? Like we evolved in these small bands of people, mixed age children playing together, choosing who they socialize with, doing their own thing, keeping themselves safe. And as they got old enough, by age 3, 4, 5, contributing to the well-being of the tribe in context. None of this like artificial, you're in a classroom with everybody the same age. You have to navigate all of their noise, all of their messy social dynamics, all of the transitions. So I could probably just info dump for a solid hour about why unschooling is a good idea for PDAers. That said, I identify very much as an mostly internalized PDAer. It really fits me. It makes sense, the nervous system piece. And I loved school. School was a special interest for me. So that's the big caveat, is that some PDA kids actually love school, including alternative schools. I went to a progressive elementary school. It was my special interest for years. And when you have a learning environment that fits into that autistic special interest slot in the autistic psyche, then a lot of these other triggers are not felt as triggers in the same way. And that's because the special interest slot, like it cues safety, it cues belonging, it cues connection, it cues mastery, it cues all these great things in a way that a lot of conventional school environments don't for kids. The last thing I want to say is that for some kiddos, school is what I call a heart outside the circle. So if we go back to that safe circle metaphor, you can have something be dysregulating to the body, but the heart and the head love it. And I call that a heart outside the circle, because the safe circle is not defined by what you love. It's defined by what your body can do while feeling safe and regulated. And for many PDAers, school is actually a heart outside the circle. And that may be true for some of your listeners who have kiddos in more social, structured, alternative learning environments. And if you see those kiddos loving it, but coming home dysregulated, it's just a good noticing that almost certainly means that school environment is a heart outside the circle. They love it, but their body is dysregulated by it and is accumulating stress during the day, right? If they're quote unquote fine at school and they fall apart at home, they're not actually fine at school. That's just a basic important thing about nervous systems, because if you're really, really fine at school, you're not going to fall apart at home. And so that's a whole other conversation, but like, how do we support hearts outside the circle? But it's just part of the map.
For parents or caregivers listening to this who are practicing independent learning, right?
Yeah.
How can they support learning and curiosity and growth without triggering the nervous system? What does that look like?
So it all comes back to that understanding that a child does not need to be taught or coerced to learn and explore. A child will naturally do that the way that a puppy will play and the way that a tree will grow. It's in our nature. So our job as caregivers is not to direct the learning. It's to provide an environment that cues safety to the child's body, and to provide opportunities that are accessible to the child to explore their passions. And that's just a very different affect. It's a different relational stance than, how do I get them to do math? How do I get them to write? And it requires really trusting that certainly the population I serve, our kids are, and we as adults, we're on atypical paths. I openly shared my child is 8 now. He's been unschooling for 3 years. He is thriving by all my definitions of thriving. And he can't write his name and he can't type yet. Those things are just not accessible to his nervous system it's mostly his nervous system, honestly. At this point, we were able to bridge it. Like, he knows how to hold a pen now. He can draw things, but he has zero intrinsic motivation to write, and it requires some kind of didactic, like, here's how you do it. And he can't access that right now, right? So my job as his mom is not to fret and wring my hands about it. It's to trust that it's in his nature to want to acquire these skills. And I want to look at where there is possibility. So like 6 months ago, I started playing tic-tac-toe, and he was like, oh, what's that? And that he loves gaming. So like, okay, he loves gaming. That's a bridge into his safe circle. So we introduced some of these fun, easy, like games on paper. Well, what did that do? It supported him in holding a pen and pencil. Amazing. But I didn't even touch that for several years because we were working on his nervous system recovering from burnout and getting access to some pretty basic needs in his safe circle. So it's about following the capacity of your kid's nervous system, which may or may not be an issue for for listeners where you're like, I'm just on an alternative path and this just isn't an issue. Great. You can do tabletop learning with your kid. You can get them something fun. And maybe they'll lap it up. For PDA kids, it really requires tracking what kind of actual capacity does my kid have in their nervous system. If sleeping, eating, peeing, pooping, and staying hydrated, medication, if those things are outside the safe circle, anything else is not necessarily the priority. And what we want to do is just cue as much safety as possible, as much access to special interests as possible, as much access to safe sensory environments, in order to support that safe circle and widening enough that they can access their basic needs. Then we can think about, like what kind of interesting math might happen. And for PDAers, I'm going to give you a couple of really easy, actionable things. One is do your own passion projects. If you are passionate about your own learning and you are not pressuring your child, again, they are a pro-social mammal who is hardwired to learn from the adults around them. That's a low pressure, wonderful environment for a kid to learn. My kid is passionate about many of the things I'm passionate about, not because I pressured him, because I just modeled it from when he was very young. So natural history, maths and sciences. He loves directing me in my art projects. He doesn't like to do the art, and that's fine, but he loves directing me. And he really considers himself, and I gave him this title, he's a co-founder of our business. So he's learning every time he came and said hi before we started recording on the podcast. He comes to my office hours. So he's engaging the way, again, this is how humans are much more wired to learn than what we do in school. He's learning from the real contextual work of the adults in his life. So that's one thing. Do your own passions and do it in a way that actually feeds you if you have the time and capacity. Second is to strew. So this is a really common word in the PDA world, and it means to leave things out or to offer things in a totally non-pressure way where the PDAer in question can stumble upon them, can see you doing it, is welcome to engage in it with no pressure. So for instance, I noticed my kiddo was like kind of done with video games the other day. And every week my husband and I check in about like, what off-screen games and activities do we want to strew for him? And again, that was not during burnout. That was once he's really recovered and been doing well for a while. And we were thinking, you know what? He's 8. He loves math. I think like perimeter and area would actually be a really fun concept just to dabble with him. So I didn't say, hey, kiddo, I want to teach you perimeter and area. I just noticed a moment where his attention was like a little bit in flux. And he was like not quite sitting down, right? He's like a little bopping around. And I just sat on the couch with a pencil and a piece of paper and I started drawing a square. And he asked what I was doing. Because that's the relationship that doesn't work if you've spent the last couple of years trying to get your kid to sit down with you, right? You have to let it be for a while for them to trust that you're not coercing them. But if you have that relational trust, then you're just doing something cool and interesting. And again, they're curious, great apes, so they're going to come check it out. So we did like a 15-minute thing on perimeter and area, and then he's done. And it's all about really respecting when the kiddo is done. So follow your own passions and strew. Those are probably the two biggest.
I love it. It's so practical.
Yeah.
You talked a bit about burnout and recovery. Let's talk a little bit about that and what it looks like, what recovery looks like. How long does it take? And I imagine it completely varies, but
yeah.
What is your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, so that question could be its own 12-session course. I was going to say it could be its own hour podcast, but it could be. So I'll try to answer succinctly. Autistic burnout and PDA burnout are not clinically recognized states. So there is not one definition of them. The way that I define burnout is when the safe circle gets so small. So again, the person's physiological capacity to feel safe in any given moment gets so small that one or more basic needs that they need to thrive and be well can no longer fit. So when your body is so fried that you can no longer eat most of your safe foods, that's an indication that you are either in or sliding towards burnout. A kiddo who was using the toilet and then can't anymore, right? And either is pooping and peeing on the floor or needs to be back in pull-ups, that's an indication that you're sliding towards or in burnout. Somebody who had a ton of passions and like outside the house and then can't leave the house anymore, also indication. So there is no let's check this in this box. And this is where the safe circle as a framework is so helpful because burnout will look different for different people. So what we're looking at is based on this person's thriving self, where their safe circle can fit, XYZ, like seeing a couple friends a week, going to a museum, sitting down and doing some math, whatever their beautiful, atypical, autistic PDA life would look like in its most thriving version. Burnout is going to be really constricted in compared to that. But you want to always be comparing it to the person's own thriving and not to what society thinks is right. Because there are plenty of PDAs who are out of burnout and still barely leave the house. Because it turns out just a lot of autistic people like being at home and we feel safest here. So that's why I spend a lot of time in the beginning of my course defining thriving for a given person, right? For kids, it's often going to look like a safe circle that shrinks a lot and often very suddenly from the perspective of the parent. From the perspective of the kid, it's not actually sudden. And once you see it, you're like, oh shoot, the warning signs were there. But it will often look like a safe circle that only has, say, one parent in it. A computer, often YouTube and gaming are the things that remain in the safe circle. And we can talk about why. I think there's very good reasons for that. And it's not just, screens are so addictive. No, there's actually really real reasons, I think, that YouTube and gaming are in most kids' safe circles in burnout. And one or two rooms in the house. And then some basic needs will be gone from the safe circle. So they'll lose access to their diet. They'll lose access to toileting in the bathroom, or that they might have gone from a regular sleep schedule to not being able to go to sleep at a regular time. And part of what my approach does is it helps give a really concrete visual, intuitive exercise for mapping nervous system capacity. And then the way you get out of burnout is you clock as many hours as humanly possible feeling safe. That's it. That's my husband's line. When our son came home for the last time from school and we realized what damage had been done, we're never sending him back there. I don't care what we have to do we're not. He said, our only job right now is to help him clock as many hours as possible feeling safe in his body. And it was the most beautiful guiding principle, and it served us so well. And so what that often looks like is getting very granular about what are the arrows, right? What PDA world calls them demands. I really prefer to say arrows because anything that stresses the nervous system is relevant, not just the losses of autonomy and control and social equality. So sensory overwhelm, feelings of shame, anything that is a stressor is jabbing at that safe circle. And so the more we can mitigate and remove all the arrows that we can from a child's life, and then provide co-regulation, access to special interests, sensory safety, really getting very granular about what's most important here is for them to feel safe. That means that things that we used to think of are non-negotiables, like brushing your teeth, not having 3 helpings of ice cream in a day, whatever it is. When you look through the nervous system lens, you start to realize how much of that is negotiable. And that without a nervous system that has the capacity to feel safe, your life legitimately doesn't work. And certainly for a child, the more years they rack up feeling in survival mode, the more we're setting them up for an extremely difficult adulthood. And again, this can happen without any adverse childhood experiences. This can happen for people with financial privilege, with white privilege, with class privilege. All the more so is it freaky and scary for Black and brown people, especially in America, right? Kiddos in school to prison pipelines, folks who are in wage earning jobs where they can't take the time off. Like, it's part of why I set my community up with essentially no financial barrier. It's a equity based fee scale, and if my lowest rate is too high, I go down to as little as $0. Because there is so much need for support and so much of it is expensive. And so many of the people who need the support the most can't afford it. So all of this intersects with race and class, obviously, and other intersecting things. How long it takes to recover from burnout depends on a lot of factors. One is it's not like, oh, you hit burnout, now the clock starts in recovery. When the clock starts in recovery, when the person can clock like 95% of their day feeling safe. Okay, that's when recovery really starts to start. And from there, it's like a year-ish, depending on a lot. It depends on if a caregiver is still in the safe circle. It's great if they are. It depends if the kiddo can access meds. It's great if they can. If those meds work. And it also depends on the kind of general affect of the home, right? There are some what I call red arrows that you cannot remove. So there might be chronic illness, there might be a new baby, there might be pollution, there might be systemic racism, there might be economic insecurity. Like, there's stuff that you can't remove, and any stressor can prolong the burnout, essentially. But the basic tenet is spend as much time inside the safe circle as possible, because what burnout is physiologically is it's essentially like an extremely sprained or inflamed nervous system. So you want to calm it down the way you would with an inflamed ankle and help it feel rest. And then it's trusting, then it goes back to that, what is a child? Trusting that as they feel safe, the safe circle will expand, and they will by nature get their curiosity back and their desire to explore back. And that if they're not, it's not because you're not pushing them, it's because there's something going on still in their nervous system, their biochemistry, they're not feeling safe enough yet.
Fascinating. What amazing work you do. My final question is, how do you help families, parents, caregivers navigate siblings, extended family, the life that we have around us? How do you support, what advice do you offer families with that?
Yeah. So the first big advice is to learn the safe circle metaphor. It's a little bit more, it's quite simple. It's a little bit more involved than I got into in the podcast. So download my coloring book, because what that offers is a visual representation of the nervous system that crosses all neurotypes. And as I said before, crosses species even. Works for my dog. So siblings who are or are not PDA or autistic can, if they have room in their own safe circles to learn something like this or to be introduced to it, can learn the idea of a safe circle. They can learn the idea of antenna, and they can learn the idea of extra sensitive or extra antenna, as I call it, just to be simple. They can learn the idea of a smaller or a larger safe circle on a given day. This is the idea of a dynamic disability. They can learn the idea of an arrow, like, oh, right, my sibling or my grandchild experiences when I interrupt them as a big arrow. So, oh, it makes sense they left their safe circle because I kept interrupting them, etc. I have found that, like, I get referrals sometimes from other PDA thought leaders of folks who are like, have spouses or grandparents who are stuck not understanding PDA, and I can do like half an hour, use half of a coaching session with this metaphor, and they're like, oh, now I get it. So really understanding this visual idea of nervous system capacity, of triggers, of the idea that capacity shrinks or widens depending on how safe we feel. And the idea that neurodivergent people, by nature, part of how I would define neurodivergence, one of the ways you could define it is that we have particularly sensitive or insensitive, depending on the antenna ringing our safe circle. But everyone has antenna, and that's why the metaphor is so powerful. So the first thing is get some language that normalizes this idea that we all have nervous systems, that they all have different antennae. And then you can visualize it. I have a client who, a community member, where all three of her kids did their safe circles as part of their unschooling project one day. And that was really powerful for them. And then the other piece is that there are going to be, for some of us, there will be some people who just can't. I'm going to say can't and not won't, because that's what we say in the PDA world, who just cannot get it. And a lot of those people are themselves likely PDA, and their own antenna are really threatened by the idea of disability or of accommodations, maybe their own internalized ableism, maybe their own just the way that their brain wiring works, rigidity. It's often there are co-parents or co-parents who are exes of my clients, or co-parents who are still happily married, but are sort of quote unquote behind. I don't who haven't deeply gotten this yet. And part of the work there is understanding what you can and can't control. And the truth is that for anyone, your child included, you can't control what goes into their safe circle. That's really the job of their antenna and their body. And so obviously with a child, we meet them where they're at, but there are going to be friends or extended family members where the wisest thing to do is to gently remove yourself from the relationship with as little drama as possible. The in-between from total removal or them getting it is just making really clear boundaries. Like, I get that this isn't landing for you, and we are consulting with experts. We understand what we're doing, and it's not really up for debate. So I would rather we talk about something else, right? And like, if you keep talking about it, I'm just going to need to walk away. I'm sorry. It's just too much. So part of it is just knowing where your boundary is. If you don't want to really leave the relationship, or you can't, then it's about making boundaries. And this is a really important reason why I started a community. Like, the last part of my answer here is come join my community, because I was trained as a congregational rabbi and a community organizer. And what both of those those two vocations gave me the worldview that liberation is collective. It's communal. We do not walk radically different paths by ourselves. Again, we are social mammals. We don't do well when we're doing something different from the herd. So if the herd that you're in, if the tribe that you're in is all walking a conventional path, it's a great moment to notice that. And obviously, if you're listening here, you're already involved with Mosaic, so fabulous. And if you're like, oh, PDA resonates, come check out my community. And that's going to be a really warm place where you can walk with other people through online real connections, Zoom meetings, feeds, direct messages, affinity circles. Essentially, it's like a secular congregation. You tap in as you want to, of all people walking the same road, because it's a lot easier to say lovingly to your in-laws, I really get this is hard and we do know what we're doing and it's not up for debate, when you have like your 10 people who you know from this community at your back. It's a lot easier.
What a wonderful note to end on. Just that sense of we're all in this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. For those listening, you may have noticed that this conversation asks something deeper than just what are new strategies. It invites us all to sort of shift how we see. As we begin to understand behavior as communication from the nervous system, not as something to quote fix, but something to interpret, we respond differently. And that's what I've really gotten out of this conversation, at this shift of just how we're looking at this whole situation. And for families navigating PDA and hypervigilant nervous system, this isn't a quick formula. This is a path, and one that centers safety, autonomy, connection, community, your tribe you talked about. And when those conditions are in place, something important happens. It's not compliance, but it's trust. That's what I.
That's right. And it's two-way trust. Yes.
And it's not control, it's capacity.
Yeah.
It's not just coping, but the possibility for a child to truly know themselves and to thrive and to create that safe space, that safe circle in order for them to thrive. I really appreciate it. If this conversation resonated, we invite you to continue exploring these ideas with us inside Mosaic, where we're building practical pathways and support for families who are walking this road every day. Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for spending time with the Independent Learner Podcast. If today sparked new ideas or questions, you're not alone. You can find more conversations and support through the Mosaic Collective at mosaic-collective.org. We're glad you're here.
Resonate.